Whether it's the NHS, the schools, the trains, net zero, the government has plans for radical transformations. No more of the same in health. Wes Streeting tells us that there is no more money unless there are reforms. These are bold and ambitious plans. These are the right things to do. But they raise quite a lot of questions about the end of these processes, what's going to be achieved, when it's going to be achieved, and absolutely fundamentally, how it's going to be that we get from here to there. The politics of all of this are extraordinarily important. Keir Starmer is right when he talks about a 10-year programme. Actually, it's more like 20 years. You can't transform the health service in 5 years. Turning around the railways is an enormous task, made all the worse by agreeing pay deals without any agreement about working practices. Now, if you want to transform an energy system which is 75% fossil fuel dependent throughout the economy as a whole, into one that's essentially almost completely low carbon, net zero at some date, then that's a 30-year programme. It isn't something that can be done in the 50 months, for example, that the Secretary of State, Ed Miliband, has in mind for getting to net zero in electricity. And school transformation is notoriously slow. Rebuilding our universities may be a bit quicker, but you get the picture. The programs to do this stuff just take a lot of time. And it's all very well to tell people, don't worry, things can only get better, as Tony Blair once said, as long as that's their lived experience. And if you look at these major transformations and the no more money for the NHS without reform, and think through the politics of what happens between now and 228 or 229 when the next general election comes along, there is a really difficult and practical problem that Keir Starmer and his ministers have to confront. And that is that contrary to the idea that things can only get better, in the short run, if you really want to do radical reform, things can only get worse. It's true that there's the sunny uplands in the 230s if you really got on with these processes, but it's not true that there's sunny uplands between 25 and 228, 229. It just isn't going to be like that. And you can look at all sorts of transformations, radical reform programs, transitions that have been carried out in the past and see how that goes. Think how painful the Thatcher reforms were in the 1980s. Things truly did get a lot worse after the first Thatcher election before they got, arguably, somewhat better towards 1990. It did take a decade, and indeed most of the major measures, the privatisations, didn't happen until 1990. If you look at industrial examples, the new chief executive arrives and we're going to have a radical strategic review, call in some consultants, think about brave new plans to take things forward, and then get on with it. Well, it comes with blood, sweat and tears when it gets to the implementation stage. And you can see what's going to happen in the NHS. If you really want to radically reform the NHS, you start doing things like reassessing what everybody does. You start replacing people with digital technologies and equipment. You start borrowing money to buy stuff. You start in a world in which a lot of uncertainty is created for the existing workforce. These are all inevitable things that happen in transitions. And in that time period, the results usually get worse before, quote, the corner's turned. Think of a modern industrial example. Think of Rolls-Royce. Think about the pain and blood and red ink on the carpet, which has led ultimately to the turning around of that great company. Many more examples are out there. So when we look forward through the next period, let's just think about which things are going to get worse by the next general election before they then get better. And then think about how politicians can sell the medium and long-term benefits for the short-term pain to the electorate going forward. So take net zero, that's the big one. Why would anyone think that putting loads of bricks on the accelerator to dash for net zero for electricity by 2030 is going to reduce bills? Why would anyone really believe, as the Great British Energy website said before the election, everyone's going to have 300 quid off the bills? Why would you think the policy is going to deliver that? Surely if you rush to get to a target, you have to pay top dollar for all the equipment out there when everybody else is also trying to get transformers, cables, materials, batteries, all the kinds of things that are needed. Surely it costs quite a lot to build a charging infrastructure for EVs. Surely it costs a lot to import all those solar panels and steel and so on, not helped by closing down your domestic steel industry for fine steels as an aside. These things are going to be disruptive. These things are going to cost. And it's not good enough to say, oh, they're not really cost, they're investments. Yes, it's true that we're going to have some enhanced assets. But almost all of net zero is about producing an equivalent amount, slightly more actually, electricity than we did under the old system by changing the technique. In the true sense, the whole net zero program electricity is one giant capital maintenance program. So just saying, oh, well, it's borrowing, so it isn't going to cost, isn't really true. Indeed, it's a fabrication of a political argument which the public don't buy into. And that's why there's so much rebellion against specific programs which really are difficult. Let's talk about the transformation from boilers, gas boilers, to heat pumps. Just take a look at the votes in Germany, let alone the response here, to see the consequences. The compulsion of getting rid of fossil fuel cars, petrol and diesel cars, with EVs. All these things start to become much more difficult in cost terms when they are practical and about to happen and immediate. And that's where you end up in the difficult world that you've gone flat out for something. You paid top dollar for all the supply chain, almost all of which in the UK's case is overseas. And then the targets get delayed because the public, the voters, discover that prices go up, not down. The gas price might fall, and that might cushion a lot of these impacts. But that would be ironic, given the Secretary of State keeps telling us that the reason we're doing all of this lot is not just for climate change, but it's to get out of high and volatile gas prices. I don't know how often the Secretary of State looks at the gas and the oil prices in international markets, and I don't know how often he looks at energy modelling going forward, but my guess is that actually what we're going to be doing is getting out of lower and potentially less volatile gas and oil prices going forward. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do the transition, but it means you should be honest and tell people that the transition is not going to be cheap, it's going to be expensive, and the reasons we have to do this are to do with our responsibility in terms of climate change, not as some cheap growth strategy, which clearly it isn't. The health service is in a very difficult position, and that's partly because the population has become so unhealthy. The government's absolutely right in its diagnosis of the problems. The difficulty is that when the first sign of gunpowder or voter opposition starts coming forward, who believes that the government's going to hold the line and say no more money without reform? My guess is they will throw more money at it. Many governments have tried reform in the past and they found that the short-term politics are extremely difficult. And even when we look across that the case of example Thames Water. We're told that there's a transformation strategy that the new chief executive is bringing in. Good. That's exactly what's needed. Does anyone think that Thames Water's performance will get better during the process of reassessing what the workforce is doing, changing their working practice, etc.? No, it'll get probably worse before it gets better. Now, what all this says is that for Labour, the 228-229 election is going to be very difficult. And it's going to have to explain to the wider public why the outcomes are not the golden sunny uplands of 228-229, but rather why what they will have been through in the next 4 years is worth doing for those sunny uplands in the 230s and the 240s and beyond. That's the political challenge, and the electorate isn't stupid, but if they're told everything's going to get better because everything was down to the failures of the Conservatives, ignore what happened in the first decade of this century, ignore the financial crisis, ignore the problems of dealing with COVID, and just promise better and better, that ain't going to wash. And that's particularly difficult for this government because although there is that kind of sense that the Conservatives are in great difficulty and so on and so forth, Labour should take note that there are about 80 or 90 seats in which reform came second, which are Labour seats. And this neat little idea that the Reform Party is going to, quote, destroy the Conservatives and usher in an era of 10, 15, 20 years of Labour governments is utterly naive when you look against where the reform vote may be. And it may be really rather important for the government in planning its transition to target exactly those groups who might otherwise be tempted to reform, to explain how the costs that they're going to bear, and energy is just one of them, are going to be worth doing going forward. None of this says that the government shouldn't do the reforms. It just says the reforms are inherently difficult, both in economic terms, of course, in management terms, but they're also inherently difficult in terms of the short-term pain that's involved. One of Mrs. Thatcher's merits was that she never hid from the public the scale of the short-term pain that was going to happen. It's much derided that Mrs. Thatcher said there is no alternative. But actually, when Starmer says that he has some admiration for Thatcher, it's exactly that point that he should grasp for and his government grasp for. What he needs to explain in order to ensure that this transformation is embedded and the British public goes with it is why there is no alternative way of spending ourselves out of the current difficulties. That's the challenge. And it is, in that sense, one of those political moments where the future is really about convincing people that the current economic policies, the current framework, the current debt, the current public spending is just not sustainable going forward. If not, if we carry on telling people electricity bills are going to go down, etc., then the next election does not look particularly hopeful for the Labour Party going forward. And you can see that contrast. The story from the Secretary of State on the energy front is sunny uplands everywhere, and immediately as well as further into the future. The story from Rachel Reeves and the Treasury is quite different and altogether more robust. Thank you.